What do people today spend most of their time on? And what do they consider most important in life? In many cases, people rush after having more, a better house, higher status, a more secure future. But Jesus says in today's passage, verse 20, "But store up for yourselves treasures in heaven." This teaching is not simply about rejecting material things, but about what we place at the center of our values as we live. Jesus said in verse 21, "For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." This shows that the direction of our hearts, the focus of our lives, ultimately depends on what we treasure as our treasure. The command, "Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, but store up for yourselves treasures in heaven," is as important as a life guidebook for Christians living today. Therefore, hoarding much on earth is not a desirable approach. Water, when confined, easily becomes stagnant. It loses its freshness and gradually develops mold. Water must always flow and move to remain clear and pure. Likewise, wealth, if merely stored away, easily decays. And conflicts arise over that wealth. Accidents happen. Eventually, thieves and robbers invade. Therefore, material possessions should be used and utilized for good as much as possible. No matter how valuable a treasure may be, if it is merely hoarded, it loses its worth. Thus, a treasure hidden deep inside a wardrobe has no value. That is why the text says not to store treasures on earth, but to store them in heaven. There are two reasons for this. One is because this world changes. The defining characteristic of this world is change. Everything in the world is finite. Therefore, everything changes. Time, the world, people, nature all change. Thus, the things of this world are not trustworthy. Nothing is eternal. That is why the Lord commands us to store up treasures in the unchanging heaven. Furthermore, there is no safe place in this world. Everything in this world changes and is imperfect. Therefore, there is nowhere to safely store treasures. Even places deemed safe cannot truly keep them secure. That is why the Bible instructs us to store our treasures in heaven. At this point, you might think to yourself, "I don't really have any treasures at home, so this doesn't apply to me," or you might wonder, "But how exactly are we supposed to store treasures in heaven?" But the treasure spoken of here does not refer to such things. Gold bars or diamonds are called treasures. Yet there are far more precious treasures in this world than those. God has given every person a treasure more precious than money or jewels. That is why He commands us to cherish this precious treasure. So, what is this precious treasure that God has shared with us? First, the time we have received from God is itself a treasure. If there is truly a precious treasure in this world, it is time. We were all born into this world through time. We live under the dominion of time, and someday we will reach the limit of that time and die. That is why the Bible tells us to make the most of your time. When we were born into this world, each of us was allotted a different amount of time to live on this earth. Some are born with 60 years allotted. Others come into the world with 70, 80, or 90 years. When that time is up, they must depart. Yet no one knows when that time will end. Whether it will be tomorrow, the day after, or next year, no one knows. If we have no time allotted to us, wealth, riches, and glory are useless. So where is there a treasure more precious than this time? Time cannot be compared to jewels or gold bars. Those things, even if you have them, you can live without. If you don't have them, you can still live. But time, once it passes, is gone forever. It's over. It cannot be used again. That is why the Bible tells us to make the most of our time. Because time is a treasure. It tells us to store up this precious time in heaven. So, invest and use as much of this precious time as possible for God. That is what it means to store up in heaven. When the hour of death approaches, it becomes evident who has stored up much of this treasure called time for heaven. When the time comes to settle worldly affairs, the time of death, regret floods in. A lifetime flashes before one's eyes like a galloping horse, and standing before God becomes a reality. Those who dread and fear the time of death so intensely do so because they have invested no time for God. They must go, but since they have invested nothing there, fear is inevitable. However, those who have invested and used much time for God become detached when that time comes. They become calm, and hope arises, because they have already invested much time in God's kingdom. This is precisely what it means to store up treasures in heaven. Furthermore, youth and health are treasures. Youth and health are treasures among treasures. Yet many people fail to recognize these as precious treasures until they lose their youth and health, only then belatedly realizing their value. When we stand before God's judgment seat later, we may be asked, "What did you live for in your youth?" It is said that Jews educate their children to give a good answer to this question. The time of youth is like the sun at its zenith, the sun at midday. It is the most hopeful and promising time in life. That is why it is called the golden age of life. Yet, at the judgment seat, we may be asked what we used this precious golden age of life for. He will see whether we joyfully offered that precious youth for God's glory and His kingdom. However, we may have been led into darkness, squandering our youth on futile things, only to lose it and let it pass. But if I still have health left to me now, I must not squander even that precious health. I must now make the wise choice to store up treasures in heaven. With that health, I must pray for the Lord's kingdom and His righteousness, joyfully serve the church, which is the body of Christ, and store up the treasure of health in heaven, even if I no longer have youth. Therefore, if I still have youth and health left to me, I must store them up in heaven. By using youth and health for the Lord, the gospel, and the church, we can store up that treasure in heaven. The hymn declares, "Offer what is precious to the Lord, exert all your strength while young. Fight the good fight of truth with all your zeal. Offer what is precious to the Lord, give your body and your heart. Devote everything to the Lord, serve Him with all your might. Even if youth has passed, while health remains, offer that healthy body and mind to the Lord in service." That is the secret to storing treasure in heaven. And material wealth also becomes treasure when stored in heaven. Using material wealth abundantly for the sake of God's kingdom means it becomes treasure in heaven. When used for God's kingdom, this material wealth has no side effects. There are no after effects. However, because people keep using it in useless places, problems arise, after effects occur, and conflicts are created. When that happens, joy is stolen, and fulfillment is not gained. Wealth, if simply hoarded, inevitably leads to problems. Side effects occur, and conflicts arise. When you see a family with discord, it is mostly because they have accumulated a lot of material possessions. Material possessions reveal their virtue, power, and good outcomes only when used and applied appropriately. That is why the Bible instructs us to store up treasures in heaven. For there are no thieves, and no rust. First, treasures stored on earth perish, but treasures stored in heaven are eternal. It is foolish to seek to store up treasures on earth out of concern for earthly life. In verse 19, it says, "Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moths and vermin destroy, and where thieves break in and steal." Jesus is comparing earthly treasures with heavenly treasures. Earthly treasures will one day vanish. Wealth, honor, and power can all crumble and disappear in an instant. But treasures stored in heaven will never perish. Heavenly treasures refer to the fruits of faith that God remembers and will eternally reward. Blessed are those who store up treasures in heaven. In our country, there was once Deaconess Yun Shin-a, who was used as a vessel of divine healing. One day, she had a dream. In the dream, she ascended to heaven. An angel showed her the house she would have, but her house looked so shabby. She asked why her house was so shabby. The angel replied, "It is because the things you sent up to heaven while you were on earth were so insignificant." When Yun awoke from the dream, she was shocked and deeply troubled. So he sold the prayer house and all the property he owned in his name, and donated everything for North Korean missions. Jesus said in Matthew chapter 19:21, Jesus answered, "If you want to be perfect, go, sell your possessions and give to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. Then come, follow me." This was the highest teaching Jesus gave to the rich young man. However, the rich young man could not digest Jesus's words and went home troubled. After that, he never came back to Jesus again. The rich young man missed the opportunity to store up treasures in heaven with earthly wealth. Similarly, a certain farmer, having cultivated his land and reaped a bountiful harvest, was so pleased with himself that he thought, "Now I have food in store for many years." My soul, you have every reason to be satisfied, and he was content. But that very night, the Lord spoke to him. Luke chapter 12:20-21. But God said to him, You fool! This very night, your life will be demanded from you. Then who will get what you have prepared for yourself? This is how it will be with whoever stores up things for themselves but is not rich toward God. This teaches that those who hoard wealth on earth, instead of storing treasures in heaven, will ultimately depart this world in vain, never having fully utilized their possessions. Most wealthy people today are like this foolish rich people. In the last days, when the Lord opens heaven's window of opportunity to transfer the wealth of the wicked to the righteous, we must diligently use that wealth to focus on saving souls and spreading the gospel, thereby storing treasures in heaven. To those who think they have no wealth, are poor, and have no treasure to store up in heaven, Jesus says this. Mark 12:43-44, calling his disciples to him, Jesus said, Truly I tell you, this poor widow has put more into the treasury than all the others. They all gave out of their wealth, but she, out of her poverty, put in everything, all she had to live on. The 2 small coins this widow put into the offering box were worth about $2, or roughly 3,000 won. Thus, we see that storing up treasures in heaven from a state of poverty holds far greater value than the offerings of the rich. The Lord does not evaluate based on the absolute amount of the offering, but rather on the person's level. If someone from wealth gives a large sum, and someone from poverty gives a small amount, but it is their entire daily living expense for that day, then the poor person's 3,000 won offering is a far greater treasure in heaven. Therefore, the path to storing up treasure in heaven makes no distinction between the rich and the poor. The reason we must store our treasures in heaven, not on earth, is because what is stored on earth will soon perish. Storing treasures on earth means keeping them for oneself in banks or safes. It signifies selfish accumulation and a life lived for one's own benefit. It means living with an attitude that material possessions alone make everything possible. However, treasures hoarded on earth for oneself with this attitude do not last long and will soon vanish. Whether it be wealth, business, health, talent, or beauty, treasures hoarded on earth for oneself will soon disappear. Economic collapse, political downfall, disaster, illness, or death can instantly take away the treasures hoarded on earth. Therefore, Proverbs chapter 23:5 states, Cast but a glance at riches, and they are gone, for they will surely sprout wings and fly off to the sky like an eagle. And why must we store our treasures in heaven? Because verse 21 says, For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. For the most important thing in a person is the heart. When the heart departs, there remains no love, no joy, no happiness, nothing at all. If our heart departs from God, that is the greatest misfortune. It is misfortune for us and misfortune for God. God has said He sees our heart. But when we store up treasures on earth, our hearts gradually drift away from God and draw closer to the earth. Lot's wife loved her possessions, and her heart departed from God. Demas loved the world, and his heart departed from God. Judas Iscariot was the same. That is the greatest misfortune. Our greatest happiness is for our hearts to always be directed toward God. That is grace and blessing. When we offer our treasures to God, our hearts turn toward God. When we use our treasures for what pleases the Lord, our hearts turn toward the Lord. That is why it says, For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. To keep our hearts turned toward God, we must store our treasures in heaven. Second, just as a healthy eye makes the whole body bright, spiritual vision is extremely important. Verses 22-23 state the eye is the lamp of the body. If your eyes are healthy, your whole body will be full of light. 23 But if your eyes are unhealthy, your whole body will be full of darkness. If then the light within you is darkness, how great is that darkness? The eye spoken of by Jesus signifies the focus of our heart, our spiritual values. A clear eye means a clear focus on God. Conversely, if the eyes are dim, worldly greed, envy, and unbelief cloud our hearts. Adam and Eve's eyes were clouded by their greed for the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil. In Genesis chapter 3:6, when the woman saw that the fruit of the tree was good for food and pleasing to the eye, and also desirable for gaining wisdom, signifies that their eyes had become corrupted and dim. Their greedy eyes led them to fall. Lot's wife, unable to let go of her attachment to worldly possessions even in extreme circumstances, looked back at Sodom and was turned into a pillar of salt. But Moses, Hebrews chapter 11:27. He persevered because he saw him who is invisible. He endured with patience, looking at God's promise through the eyes of faith. And Stephen, even as he was being stoned to death, saw the heavens opened and the Son of Man standing at the right hand of God. Today, our eyes also see the world daily. But more important than what we see is with what eyes we see. The eyes of greed see everything with dissatisfaction, but the eyes of faith see everything with gratitude. When these eyes are bright, our hearts, thoughts, and entire lives become bright. To have bright and healthy eyes, we must draw near to the light of the Word. Psalm chapter 119:105 says, "Your word is a lamp for my feet, a light on my path." Verse 22 says, "The eye is the lamp of the body." Why did Jesus suddenly bring up eyes while speaking about treasure? There is a reason. The eyes are the first tool for discerning and choosing things. It says, if your eye is single, your whole body will be full of light. Here, single means one and undivided. A person has two eyes. Yet the perspective must be one. Eyes with multiple perspectives are not single eyes. Only eyes that look solely to the Lord, eyes that view things only from the Lord's perspective, are clear eyes. If you have eyes that recognize the Lord, your whole body will be filled with light. Therefore, we must first have the right discernment regarding wealth. We are the Lord's sheep. Sheep are weak in every way. Yet if they possess just one ability, they will enjoy lifelong well-being. What is that one thing? It is eyes that recognize who my master is. Eyes that can distinguish between wealth and God. Eyes that recognize God as master. Today, if we only have eyes that truly recognize the Lord, we will enjoy abundant life. John chapter 10:9 says, "I am the gate, whoever enters through me will be saved. They will come in and go out, and find pasture." To truly make our possessions a treasure, we must store them up in heaven. But if we store these possessions on earth instead of in heaven, their value may diminish over time or corrode, leading to a loss of worth. And on earth, there is no way to keep possessions completely safe. Thieves may come, and problems may arise. That is why the Lord tells us to store up treasures in heaven. Only then do they become true treasures. And wealth must be used up while living in this world. Especially, it must be used for what God desires. That is precisely how to store up treasure in heaven. And it was said that where your wealth is, there your heart will be. If your wealth is directed toward God, then your heart will also be directed toward God. Use your wealth as a tool for faith. If you use that wealth for God and for what pleases God, then your heart will also be directed toward God. And we must break free from being ruled by wealth. Wealth often enslaves its owner. That is why the Lord said, "You cannot serve both God and wealth." Therefore, He commands us to decisively choose the Lord as our master. You cannot serve two masters at the same time. Is it wealth or God? This decision is the very essence of faith. For this to be done properly, your perspective on wealth must be correct. It is the discernment with which you view wealth. Wealth is never my master. God alone is my master. Only when this perspective is right does life become bright. Therefore, may you enjoy a blessed life throughout your days because of this right discernment. Third, those who live with a heavenly perspective enjoy true freedom and peace. In verse 23, it says, "But if your eyes are unhealthy, your whole body will be full of darkness." If then the light within you is darkness, how great is that darkness? This warning is not merely about physical sight, it warns that one's entire life can be darkened by worldly desires. However, those with a heavenly perspective do not lose their peace even in a world of comparison and competition. They choose truth even when it seems like loss. This is because they look forward to the unseen reward from God. Moses chose God's calling over the riches and glory of Egypt. Hebrews chapter 11:26 states, "He regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as of greater value than the treasures of Egypt." Because he was looking ahead to his reward. Paul considered everything in the world as rubbish. Philippians chapter 3:8 states, "What is more, I consider everything a loss because of the surpassing worth of knowing Christ Jesus, my Lord, for whose sake I have lost all things. I consider them garbage, that I may gain Christ." Their power to overcome the world came not from visible earthly things but from invisible eternal heavenly things. In verse 22, it says, "If your eyes are healthy, your whole body will be full of light." When our eyes are healthy and full of light, we no longer seek to store our wealth in this world but instead store it in heaven. Storing wealth in heaven means using it for God. It means using it for God, using it all up, and storing it in heaven. Luke chapter 16:9 states, "I tell you, use worldly wealth to gain friends for yourselves, so that when it is gone, you will be welcomed into eternal dwellings." Here, unrighteous wealth literally translates from the original Greek as the wealth of this unrighteous world. The term unrighteous here refers not to moral wickedness, but to the imperfect, temporary nature of this world's wealth that is fundamentally different in character from the kingdom of God. Ultimately, unrighteous wealth points to the fleeting material wealth given in this world. Here, make friends does not simply mean to form relationships with people, but rather to use those possessions according to the values of God's kingdom. That is, use those possessions to help the poor, to support gospel ministry, and to work for the salvation of people's souls. When you do so, even if those possessions disappear, the eternal consequences resulting from them will remain in heaven. Such actions ultimately lead to eternal reward before God. And the phrase "they will welcome you into your eternal home" signifies eternal reward, that is, eternal compensation in heaven. If you used your wealth well in this world, following God's will to lead others to salvation, this is a figurative expression, depicting the scene where they later welcome you in heaven, saying, "Because of you, I am here." Jesus was saying through these words, wealth is only temporarily entrusted to your hands. Use that wealth to do the work of love and salvation that pleases God. That is the truly wise use of wealth. Therefore, wealth must be spent in this world before you depart. If you try to save it for this world where you will not live long, it becomes a foolish choice. No matter how much wealth you accumulate in this world, once you die and leave it behind, that wealth will hold no meaning for you. Moreover, when the reckoning comes, you may face regret for not using it properly. Money does not shine in earning, but in spending. And when you spend wealth, you must spend it for God. This is what it means to store up treasure in heaven. So, what does God desire for us to do with our wealth? He desires it be used for tithes, offerings, missions, relief, and other contributions. Be mindful those who possess wealth have two masters. One is God, the other is wealth. We must choose one. How many would willingly skip church just once if skipping meant earning 100 million won? What if telling just one lie brought in a fortune? Many people follow the command of money rather than the command of God. Who is my master today? Whose command do I follow? If money rules me, I must give it up. The rich young man could not give up his wealth, so he could not believe in Jesus and left. Therefore, I pray in the name of the Lord that you may have the faith to clearly declare before your wealth that your master is God and move forward.